G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to this edition of Australia's biggest book club. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And just a reminder for those of you joining Australia's biggest book club for the first time, you can find our upcoming book clubs and other webinars at australiainstitute.org.au. So head on over there to find some of our upcoming webinars. And just a few tips before we begin. You can type questions in for our guest author, Anna Funder, today using the Q&A box on Zoom. And you can also upvote other people's questions and leave comments on them as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll kick you out. And finally, a reminder that this discussion is a live event, but it's being recorded and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel and our website later today or tomorrow. So I am super excited about today's guest. Today we are joined by Anna Funder, whose latest book, Wifedom, is an international bestseller and was a New York Times notable book for 2023. Anna, as many of you will know, is also the author of 3 other books, which includes Stasiland and the Miles Franklin Award winner, All That I Am. She was originally trained as a human rights lawyer and is a former DAAD Fellow in Berlin, an Australia Council Fellow and a Rockefeller Fellow. Welcome to Australia's biggest book club, Anna.
Thanks so much, Ebony. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you. And we're also joined today by Alice Grundy, Research Manager at the Australia Institute. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
And welcome to everyone who is joining us today. We've had a huge number of people register for today's webinar, and we're really excited for you all to join us. And in this book, which I totally loved and has been completely absorbed by, you really reckon with the reputation and the real life behavior of one of your heroes, George Orwell, whose name, as it turns out, is Eric Blair. That was something that I didn't know before I started the book. How did you come to this story of Orwell's wife, Eileen, and her role in his career and his life?
Well, it was kind of serendipitous and slightly accidental, as these things are. I found myself, it's going back 7 years now, at a moment of kind of, I don't know, privileged perimenopausal crisis in some way, a time when all your body chemistry changes and so does your sense of self. And instead of doing something sensible like getting therapy or doing lots of yoga or running a marathon or something, I turned to Orwell, which is, there are signs in my past, particularly in the writing of Stasiland, that might have been a direction that I might go in. But I started rereading Orwell one summer, and then I read the 6 biographies of him, all excellent in their own different ways, all written by men. And when I'd finished that, I wasn't cured. And so I kept reading and tootling about on the internet and found 6 letters written by Orwell's first wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, to her best friend, Nora Symes Miles, whilst they were students at Oxford reading English together in the early 1920s. These letters came to light in 2005 after the 6 major biographies were written. And in the first of them, Eileen writes, she's writing 6 months after she's married Orwell. They're living in a tiny, decrepit cottage with no electricity and 1 cold tap in a village in Hertfordshire. And Eileen says to Nora, "I'm really sorry I haven't written to you sooner, but we have quarrelled so continuously and really bitterly since the wedding that I thought I'd just write 1 letter to everyone once the murder or separation was accomplished." So I read that and that raises a whole bunch of questions. Having just come out of reading these biographies in which she barely appears, it raises the question of how can you have read, in my case, so much about Orwell and not really have any sense of who this hugely intelligent, vibrant, Oxford-educated woman who read English with Tolkien, as it turns out, as one of her tutors, have no sense of her in the accounts of his life. What were they quarrelling about in these early days of wifedom for her as she gets used to her new role. And why does she want to kill him, even in jest? So I turned back to the biographies and I went to the parts where they're describing the newlywed days in this cottage and read things like, in these newlywed days of the marriage were the happiest days of his life. Orwell had never been happier before or since. And I also read that people very close to Orwell, including his editor, Fred Warburg, and his editor and very good friend, Richard Rees, wrote things like, we couldn't figure it out, but after his wedding, his writing got so much better. So these things made me very curious about who this woman was. And I went down a very, I'm going to make a horrible mixed metaphor, a kind of joyous rabbit hole, looking for her and also examining the sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, sometimes sly ways in which she has been hidden from history. And to do that, I was looking at the biographers, the biographies, as examples of the way the life and the history of this writer, George Orwell, have been written.
Mm. You mentioned a couple of times having read those 6 biographies so meticulously. And in the book, you mentioned relatively early on the decision that you're making between whether you're going to write a fiction work or a non-fiction work. How did it feel in the writing process, as if you're sort of exploding open this new genre as you were going?
I didn't know that I was exploding open a new genre. Each of my books is responding to something in the real world I see now. You know, always to talk about this, it looks as if you knew what you were doing at the time. And that's not the case, partly possibly because I don't know what I'm doing till I'm doing it. Partly because that's where my curiosity is taking me. And if I knew exactly what I was doing, I would have the sense that I were, in a creative sense, coloring in within the lines, if you like. It's a bit obscure, but the real reason is I take these stories. So just to say, it's not evident to me what I'm doing till I'm doing it. And I certainly don't set out to be in any way genre busting, because that's a term that sounds to me kind of slightly frightening to a reader and also to a writer. If you said to yourself, this is what I'm going to do, that's not the point. The point is to take a story that is inspiring, that is making me curious, that I want to find out more about. And often when I look back now at my work, I can see this pattern in my behavior. It's a bit like looking back at your life in very public form of analysis or something. I'm interested in stories that haven't been told, and often they're stories of women. So if I look at Stasiland, 3 of the 4 stories of resistance against the GDR regime were stories of women in that book. And they seem to be perhaps the stories that history isn't telling. They're the stories of enormous courage that seem to be invisible or being swept under the carpet. All That I Am was a bit similar. It's based on the stories of 4 real people who were resisting Hitler, whose stories hadn't been told. This very earliest Jewish resistance to Hitler from 1933. So those stories are interesting in themselves. They are examples of enormous human conscience and courage. And it's also interesting why we don't know them. Why haven't they been seen? Why aren't they being celebrated is also interesting. And I think in Wifedom, that sense of why do we not know this woman's life who was so absolutely vital to Orwell's life and to his work, and how has she been disappeared? So to do that, if I'd written a novel, it would have been much easier. I would have been finished much more quickly. It probably would have been more fun. But because I wouldn't have had to tie in every single thing to a fact in the world or a quote in the biographies or some source that the biographies have missed, which is what I had to do. So there are 40 pages of endnotes here kind of sustaining the tip of the iceberg, which is the work. But if I'd written a novel, it could not sit in the world in the way that this book sits. So it wouldn't be, in a way, it's not an active witness, if you like, because where Stasi-land is, because I was talking to the real people who had resisted that regime. Everybody in this book is dead, but it's a work that is non-fiction, that is saying this woman really lived. I got permission to use her real letters, which was wonderful. So these are her real words. This is her view of the marriage from inside the marriage. This is the work she did in propaganda, in the political party in Spain, in the Department of Censorship, in Senate House, in London, working for Orwell all that time, having the idea for Animal Farm as a novel, working on that and so on. So in that way, this book had to sit as a non-fiction narrative in the world, because the image that we have of Orwell, it came to seem to me, is part fiction. And that fiction, this mythologized, decent everyman of the left, this Saint Orwell, is a myth and a fiction. And that fiction is made possible by leaving the women out, most of all Eileen, but also his mother, his aunt, his many literary girlfriends who gave him ideas, assistance, money, inspiration, editing, and so on. To leave the women out is to give the impression that this man made himself and he made his work alone. And those things are by no means true for anyone, and certainly not true for Orwell. So the reason it's a genre, blah, blah, whatever people are calling it, is because it has this, a look at the real biographies in a way, the way that I represent them, of the marriage, if you like, of the two people in it. A close look at these biographers. Let's look very closely at the level of the text. How is it that a woman who was so crucial is made to disappear in Orwell's own text, most notably Homage to Catalonia, and in these biographies? How is that done at the level, at the language level? So the passive voice and omission are so important in that. And then I wanted to bring her back to life. And that's the novelist in me. So I write scenes in which she's writing her real letters, which are clearly signposted because they're in italics. When she was writing those letters, I knew where she was. I knew where he was. I knew if he was off with someone else. And she knew it because he wanted him to know, her to know. I knew if she was ill. I knew all these things that she wasn't saying to Nora. So I could make a, sorry about that, I could make a text in which she lives and which her own account is embedded in that point of view. So that's why it makes it sound complex. I think it doesn't read in that way. I'm hoping that it reads kind of quickly. So it's a work of witness and a work of analysis of the omissions on which patriarchy relies to make men central and to make men innocent of what they do to women, and to make it look as if they do it all alone by taking the example of Orwell. And at the same time, it's a representation of my version of what she might have been thinking and feeling.
I mean, the mastery of craft that you have at both a sentence level, but also the structure of the whole, means that it's such a wonderfully readable book, while also operating in very sophisticated and literary levels simultaneously. And I think it's that level of complexity that you bring to the story, which is so useful for the readers. Eileen, as you say, fulfilled so many roles: amanuensis, typist, co-author, secretary, housekeeper. But I think one of the stories that's so compelling in the book is about her experience in Spain. And you briefly mentioned Homage to Catalonia. Could you talk a bit about how he wrote her out of his experiences there, and what kind of work she did in Spain?
Yes, look, this is a very... it took me a very long time to write the Spanish section of this book. And really, a couple of weeks before we went to print, I was still very doubtful about that section, and said to my publisher, in a moment of kind of panic, a bit like when you're having a baby and you sort of panic at the end, but it's way too late to do anything. I said, I just think maybe we should just get rid of Spain. And thank goodness she said to me, no, you can't give it to Spain. And now I'm very happy that that didn't happen. I had read Homage to Catalonia as a teenager and then later as an adult with enormous admiration and pleasure and joy and excitement. I like works of, I mean, obviously from my own work, it's clear. I like works of first-person, personal, non-fiction reportage. And it's an extraordinary story. So Orwell goes to Spain. He's a militiaman in a trench in the back blocks where he's bored out of his mind, literally trying to raise his head above the trench, almost in an effort to find a bullet to hit him. He's eventually successful in that. You can read that book, which is quite short, and in my case, you can read it twice and really not register that his wife is in Spain. Eileen is there virtually the whole time that he is in Spain. And what you certainly wouldn't register even after reading 6 biographies is that not only was she in Spain, she was working at the headquarters of the International Labour Party, the party for whom he was fighting. And she had a political role. She was writing propaganda as well as organising supply for the 31, I think it was, men who were that the ILP had in the trenches. So she was organising the letters back and forth, everything that they needed in the trenches, their supply. She visited the trenches a couple of times, came under fire when they were there, which she found very exciting. And when Orwell was wounded, she immediately went to the trenches and organised all of his medical care and accompanied him back. In that instance, he spends 2,500 words writing about being wounded without mentioning that she was there the whole time looking after him, coming to the trenches. He doesn't mention the work that she's doing. He uses the word my wife, the terms my wife, 37 times in that book. You can kind of have a look on the electronic version and count them up, but he never once mentions her by name, whereas he mentions actually quite minor male characters by name. If you don't mention someone by name, it's very hard for a reader to get a sense that they are a character who was alive in that book. I really reverse engineer some very crucial scenes in Homage to Catalonia, where it's clear that the person who is doing things that are very important things must be Eileen, but because she's not mentioned by name, he goes to some lengths to change the order of things as they're told, to interrupt them, to put it in a passive voice. For instance, Eileen, he mentions this at 2 points. Eileen is in a room which she knows, she has a very clear idea of the political situation in Spain. Orwell, she said, had a remarkable political simplicity. One of the biographers actually, just parenthetically, simply changed her words because it was obviously unbearable to say that Eileen said he had a remarkable political sympathy. But she was very politically skilled, and she was living in a situation of political terror in that office when the Stalinist agents were rounding up, killing and imprisoning left-wing fighters and people in her office. So she's very cluey about all of this. It became absolutely fascinating to me how you could write an account that leaves her out. One of the biographers, for instance, says Eileen went to Spain not because she was political at all, but because she wanted to be nearer to her husband and to be able to find for him in Barcelona treats to send to the front, such as chocolate, margarine, and cigars, full stop. And that is all that is written about her time there, when it was really not very difficult for me to find out what she was doing in that office, because her boss, an American economist called Charles Orr, left an account of Eileen saying, compared to all the other grifters, opportunists, so-called journalists, he means undercover spies, and militiamen who drifted through our office, Eileen was a superior person. And then he describes what she was doing in the office, and he also says, I can't understand why Orwell left her out. So that material was there to find. It's been around at least since the early 90s and has been left out. So it was like unraveling a cobweb. It was unraveling Homage to Catalonia, looking at what the story must have been, who must have been doing what, who is not mentioned here, and looking at where it must have been Eileen in battle scenes, in a room raid where her room is raided and she's had the foresight to put passports and checkbooks under the mattress, and so on. So it really was, I think, to my shame, I spent longer trying to write that section of the book than they spent fighting fascists in Spain.
I just, really fell in love with Eileen through this book. And so you obviously explore that she was an artistic collaborator, an editor, a co-conspirator, but all of those roles, the different roles that she inhabited and the experiences that she was having were really largely hidden from the world before your book. Can you just talk to us a little bit about what it was like making that initial discovery of her letters and her authentic voice, and just, I guess, a bit of a reflection on if you think this invisibility of wives like Eileen is really peculiar to the literary world, or part of, I guess, the broader erasure of women in history?
So to take the first part first, I mean, I touched on this when I was talking about her murder or separation letter. Eileen was so witty and so clever and so unbelievably such a good writer and unbelievably self-deprecating. So she can say 2 or 3 things, one on the line, one between the lines, one unspoken, in everything that she writes. So even almost the smallest letter will be funny, literary, very acute about other people, whereas Orwell was notoriously very, very bad at reading other people, and consequently making up, apart from Animal Farm, there was he has trouble with character in books. So she was a great joy to follow the lead and to find her and to discover who she was and to read her was very joyful experience and very exciting. The way I think, to take your second question, the way that I think about that, I think that every marriage, every heterosexual partnership, I'm looking at heterosexual partnerships as the kernel of patriarchal power relations, the basis of lots of things in our patriarchal societies. I mean, we all live in patriarchy. As far as we know, there is no other system on the planet at this time. And all relationships are different, but they are all taking place in patriarchy. And if you, to take it from the sort of statistical end, now that I'm with you at the Australia Institute, if we look at the gender wage gap, for instance, which exists everywhere, or if we look at the UN figures on women's unpaid work in the whole world, the UN estimates that if the unpaid work of women in families, communities, societies, nations had to be paid for, it would cost 10.9 trillion. That's a lot of work, which is obviously vital and sustaining us all socially, psychologically, economically. It's indispensable and also somehow invisible. If it had to be paid for, we couldn't afford it, it looks like, and yet this is what sustains the world. And somehow those things contribute to its invisibility. There's a double think going on. If we actually had a monetary value on all of that time, emotional labor, actual labor, unpaid labor, that is feminized, that is done by women, it would bring with it, in Orwell's words, in his definition of doublethink, a sense of guilt. So it's invisibilized. And along with the invisibilization of the work is the invisibilization of the women who are doing it. This applies in many areas. The idea that we still have the term domestic violence as if there were tamer ways to be dead, or assaulted, more minor, perhaps more private, less consequential, less deserving of public attention. So I'm looking at one particular marriage in all of its peculiarities and drawing out from that some general themes which applied then, possibly in a more extreme way to now, hopefully in a more extreme way to now in many societies, not all. But the kernel of the power relation, where you have a woman's work that is attributed to, that is her work to do by virtue of being a woman. To take another example, decency was a very important concept to Orwell. Orwell is associated with decency, with being a decent man. When we say someone is a decent woman or a decent wife or a decent mother or a good woman, good wife, good mother, what we actually mean is that they are doing the work of care of others. You can't be a good mum or a good wife without doing that work. That's what that means. But you can utterly be a decent bloke, a decent man, without doing any of the work of care. So if you kind of look at, there's all these different ways, linguistically, socially, statistically, economically, of looking at the position of women and men in society. Many people are obviously doing it. And my point is that in order to make men central, which they are in our society, they have more power, more money, more leisure time than women, then that centrality means women are decentered and our work is less important and becomes invisible. So I just wanted to look at the sort of basic psychosocial, if you like, ways in which this centrality and othering, visibility, invisibility works. And I took this marriage as the quintessence of that. I could have taken any male, almost any big male heterosexual artist and done this. It's just that I am a big fan of Orwell, and this is the thicket I stumbled into.
I feel as though the book's had such an extraordinary impact because of how personally people have taken your discussion of wifedom. I was reading it at the long weekend down at the beach, and a woman made a beeline across the beach to talk to me about it. She was just, she had so much to say. And I said, I haven't finished it yet, so, you know, if you could just hold off. In terms of the response to the book, what has it been like for you from readers, and how has it sort of cracked open some people's ideas of the artistic life for men in the 20th century?
I'm not sure that people are so interested in the artistic life of men in the 20th century. That's not been my impression of the response. I think a lot of women have, so the book came out simultaneously in Australia and the UK and the US. In Australia, it's almost as if it is taboo to mention this work and the unequal distribution of this work of life and love, which is immense, which keeps us all, you know, sane and loved and going. It's almost as if it's taboo to mention it. It's almost as if women, we are taught from, not even taught, part of the defining pressures, which are immense on us growing up in patriarchy, mean that we say that if you're a good person, you say, oh, it's no trouble. It was no trouble too, and the list can go on and on and on and on and on, all the things that we do. And we say it's no trouble because the work of, whether it's organizing schools or medical care or Christmas dinners or birthday parties or much more extreme things that many women, hauling water or whatever it is, those things are attributed to us as women. As I'm saying, we cannot be good women without doing that work of care. So to actually identify it as work and to say, this book is an attempt to decouple that work from the definition of what it is to be a good woman. You can be a good woman and still discuss this in your marriage. If you don't take it away from the definition of what it is to be you, this work, you can't share it. But there are many, many taboos around that, which I felt as I was writing it. I felt frightened, but I'm only sort of in retrospect now being able to really express them. On the other hand, I've had really extraordinary responses from men very beautiful responses from men who come to the book often as Orwell fans. And I was actually recently in France having to talk to readers, and the Orwell fans. Orwell has a slightly different place in the French literary canon, but yeah, my heart went out to these lovely men who, the book is not called Wifedom in French, they couldn't translate it, but these men were coming up hoping for a book on wifedom and on Orwell. Anyway, they're getting a book on wifedom. I wasn't quite sure how that was going to play, so I left the country just in time for my own safety. But I've had very lovely responses from men who have come to it as a book on Orwell, read it, and just thought, oh my God, how is it that we don't see all of this? Have I not in my life seen this in my own relationships? And they write to me these very intimate letters, so open about, did I not see this in a marriage that didn't work, for instance? Is this what I was blind to? Is this what she was saying to me? So I think men are they are as trapped as we are. They are trapped to their advantage economically, politically, in terms of power and centrality, but still trapped in ways that those letters made me realize, that might not want that unjustified privilege that is patriarchy by definition. So the reactions have been very, very moving, and I've spent a lot of time writing back to people, and some of them are hilarious. I got a letter recently from a woman in New Zealand who said, I went on a date from Tinder and I'm covered in what used to be called hickeys. And and then I read your book over the weekend and I realized that I do not have to feel sorry for this man and make him happy. So yeah, all kinds of intimacies. I think the book is intimate in so many ways that hopefully that's its sort of power, or that's where it meets people. I suppose every writer wants that, but yeah, it's.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's so lovely to think of that and all those personal interactions that you get, after the fact, and the different ways that people come to it and experience it. We're going to go to some questions from the audience now, and unfortunately, we do have to finish this webinar about 10 minutes early for some unavoidable reasons, so our apologies for that, but we'd like to get to some questions from the audience now. And the first question that I want to put to you is from Michelle Leach, Anna, and she says, this book is so valuable because it illuminates the way we as women are often the supporting act for men in our lives. As just such a woman myself, I'm wondering how you found your way to writing in the first place. For example, the courage to start and back yourself to become an author.
It's very hard, Michelle. It's hard. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's hard for male writers as well. I mean, writing is just hard. It's hard but it's exciting. You sit down and you don't know what you think until you put it on the page. You don't know what's there. I can remember starting to write Stasiland and being very surprised at the voice that turned out to be mine on the page, and that voice isn't just me. It's a response to material or to what I'm trying to do. I suspect it's harder for women. I think there's a part in Wifedom where I'm writing about Orwell, and after the relationship was over with Eileen, he does say some very heartrending things that go to this issue. Like he says, he wants to find another woman to encourage me, he says. So he's sort of saying, I need that psychological encouragement, that coaching, that someone else to believe in me so I can believe in myself, so I can muster the courage to get it down on the page. I think a lot of people don't have that. And I think also there's a limit to that. I have an extremely lovely, encouraging spouse, but in the end, it's just me and the page, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says, because half the time you don't believe it anyway, especially if it's nice, which is the kind of. So Tim Winton actually has said some really lovely things about this. Like you don't always have the courage to I'm misquoting him horribly, but courage, he says confidence is something that you don't have or not have. It's something that you can kind of manufacture in a, it's like a discipline. So it's not that you lack it. You just sort of invent it for yourself. I think he might have been saying sort of fake it till you make it, but he would have said it much better. Anyway, good luck.
The next question I've got is from Andrew T, who says, have you heard publicly or privately from any of the 6 biographers of Orwell since releasing your book?
No, I haven't. So some of them have passed away. I haven't. I think this would be a tricky book for them. I haven't heard from them. I didn't really expect to. I think some of the ways in which, I mean, the book has all of these endnotes, you know, which are all many of those endnotes are to the biographers and the biographies, because I wasn't for them. I was in the archives a bit in London and so on, but really for the most part, I was relying on the biographies, both for the facts of Orwell's life in particular. There was other material about Eileen from very good friends of hers, which they chose not to include, for instance. So I was relying on material they omitted for Eileen. But for Orwell, I rely on the biographies. And then also, so I endnote all of those things. And then I also endnote all the times where I am, if you like, taking issue with ways the biographers omitted or trivialized or doubted the accounts of women or the lives of women. So I think that's hard. I think some of it's conscious and some of it's unconscious. I don't know in what admixture, but no, I haven't heard from them. But that's okay too. You know, I wouldn't necessarily expect to.
Well, the next question from Dan Nahum kind of, I think, also refers to this and the biographies, which is, you know, you're clear in your writing that a lot of those biographers are patchy, if not outright revisionist. And so how deliberate do you think the biographers' omissions and commissions were? And what would need to change for men with an impressive corpus to be seen, warts and all, as a matter of course?
So there are many, you know, when Eileen says Orwell has a remarkable political simplicity, that's, for instance, such a devastating thing, I imagine, for a biographer to hear, if you are in the business of creating the image of a man who is not only decent, wise, but politically astute, a political oracle of some kind. To have the idea that his wife, who was, I mean, Orwell didn't go to university, his wife, who was Oxford educated, a terrific writer, worked in political jobs, which Orwell didn't, in Spain, in London, in the war, Department of Censorship in the Ministry of Information. All of those things are left out, because to say that he was, in a sense, educated by Eileen, guided by Eileen, edited by Eileen, somehow, I think, in their minds, is to distract from this man who was a self-made genius who did everything alone. So, you know, Orwell's mother and aunt were politically active. They were Fabians, they were suffragettes. His aunt was arrested with the Pankhursts in a demonstration in London for women's suffrage. His aunt, who he was very close to, ran a literary salon in London, to which luminaries came, H.G. Wells and E. Nesbit and so on. You don't get any sense of that from the biographies. So the idea that Orwell, who becomes a left-wing writer, who sees things from the position of the underdog, was brought up in a household of intellectual left-wing literary feminists, is for some reason, completely erased. And yet, as if it's a debt that he owes to women, do you know? So I think that dynamic is super interesting. And I think that that's one that, you know, is really worth examining. And I think that's, as far as I can tell, where the impetus comes for this mass erasure of women as wives, aunts, mothers, literary girlfriends, and so on.
There's a question from
There you go.
Robin O'Neill. I hope I have said that surname correctly. As an English teacher, once again, I'm teaching 1984 to year 12. However, after reading Wifedom, I'm finding it difficult to separate the narcissistic and cruel Blair from the genius Orwell. Did your research and writing change your opinion of Orwell? And is it about divorcing the man from the author, if possible?
We see, patriarchy is a system of binaries, binary thinking. And this question, Robin, is a very good question. It arises every time I talk about the book. And it is a binary question that says, well, first of all, I should say that Orwell is obviously studied in 1984 and Animal Farm, year 11, year 12, all over the country. There are quite a number of schools now who've just put Wifedom on the curriculum as well next to it. So it's sort of like the his and hers version, I guess, to explore the book and the man, the conditions out of which the books were written. I think that this binary is perhaps not a useful way of thinking about it. When we read a book that we love, that moves us, we want the love that we have for the book, because it has moved us so much, it's so intimate, we want to transfer that onto the writer. We want the writer to be also worthy of the love that we have for the book. So that's a kind of reader fallacy in a way. And it's automatic, and we all do it because writing is such an intimate art form. We transfer the love for the work onto in this case, man who made it. He must be worthy of my love. He must be amazing because he has caused me to see and to feel in this way. And I don't want to let someone who is unworthy of this great intimacy rummage around in my heart and soul. So that's what we do. And then we are massively disappointed when we find out that the writer, as all writers are, as all people are, is a flawed character. In some ways, sometimes people are dramatically, extremely flawed, Picasso or Orwell. And Picasso and Orwell say, you could take many, many others, are also living in a time when it was completely acceptable to be flawed in those ways. It was acceptable to bash your wife. It was acceptable to be unfaithful. It was acceptable to be cruel. The harm that was done to a woman that you were married to was invisibilized because it was called his private life. So to examine the writer who did it raises all of those questions, not just about the man, but also about the time that he lived in. But the other thing that I would say creatively is that, and I never want to put myself in any sentence that Orwell is in as well, because he is so extraordinary, but writers, in my experience, we write out of our flaws as much as out of anything that could be called a talent or a gift. So in Orwell's case, if you look at 1984 closely, that book is deeply sadistic. It is misogynist. It is cruel. It is paranoid. Those things allowed him to see the world the way he saw it and to represent it. But it's very unlikely that the mythological, decent, everyman, straight, heterosexual, all-seeing genius would pull from himself a vision of the world so bleak, so dark, so paranoid, so violent, so sadistic, and so misogynist. So misogyny could come from his time because misogyny was acceptable. But the other things that make 1984 valuable to us, because it shows us safely between covers, if you like, a horrific vision, and we inoculate ourselves with that vision. That vision is not going to come from an uncomplicated, decent, everyman bloke. So I think we need to hold two things in our heads at the same time. We love the art. We don't have to live with its creator. And it makes the art more interesting when we see really properly the man who made it, and not this mythological, shining knight figure on a hobby horse.
I think we have time for just one last question before we finish, which is fusing a question that I had with one from our audience. Members of your family make cameos in the book, notably your clever daughter and your supportive husband. How did they feel about being part of this literary world that you've created?
I think, I think it's never nice to be written about. And I think even if you write about people in a way that you think they're going to like, which is not what I was doing, but this is just my experience in general, people don't, it's very disconcerting to see how somebody has seen you. So not only my family, but because I wanted to bring this book into the present tense and say, these are the conditions, I'm looking at Orwell's conditions of production of his work. Those conditions of production were made by Eileen, and to some extent they were Eileen. And so it felt almost sort of honest to look at my conditions of production, in which I am, a privileged white woman living with a fantastic bloke in very comfortable circumstances. Why is it that I notice this dynamic in my life and my world? And I wanted to bring the book into the present tense. And the only things I have to hand are my sort of daily life. Also, there are friends of mine who I mentioned in the book and so on. So every single bit of the book about anybody else, including about Orwell's son, who I went to Spain with, and Quentin Kopp, the son of his commander in Spain, my friends, my kids, my husband, everything about everybody I gave to everybody before, when it was in manuscript form, just saying, is this right? And is this okay with you? So that's how I deal with that. I have absolutely no interest in getting anything wrong, for one thing, or causing any harm. There is a scene in the beginning of the book where one of my daughters says to me, "What are you working on?" And I say, "It's a biography of marriage, I think, and it's hard." And she says to me, "Why is it hard?" And I say, "Well, I think it's hard because it's hard this was at the height of Me Too, I should say. It's hard when you find out that an author that you've long loved is," and she fills it in and she says, "an asshole." And I say, yeah, I suppose that's that. And then she just says to me, "So why are you interested in this, Mum?" And I said, "What? Maybe this is so risky to a 16-year-old or anyone. Well, maybe I'm an asshole." And she just sort of shrugged and said, "Well, isn't everybody?" Which is kind of heartbreaking. But then when I was finishing the book, I obviously gave it to her and said, "What do you want that in or not in, or how are you feeling about it?" She goes, "I want that in." So yeah, it's very important to me. I have no interest in writing anything that harms anybody.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there, but we want to thank you so much for your time, Anna Funda, and for writing such an absorbing book. What a gift. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you everyone who has joined us online and for all your wonderful questions. As usual, sorry that we can't get to them all. Thanks to my colleague Alice. And don't forget, you can check out our future editions of Australia's Biggest Book Club. The next one is coming up on Friday, the 8th of November. Bill Brown will be speaking with Josh Bornstein about his new book, Working for the Brand. You can find all that, as well as the Australia Institute's research, at australiainstitute.org.au. You can find Wifedom in all good bookshops, and please do check it out if you haven't already. It's an absolutely fantastic read. And thank you again, Anna, for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining Australia's Biggest Book Club.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks, Ebony. Thank you. Bye.
Everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.